most important thing we hope to get out of the meeting today is gathering a group of interested people who will help us go forward to start this preservation project investment group so we can get more money going into preservation projects and help people learn how they can benefit financially from investing in preservation.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Kim Trent, Executive Director of Knox Heritage, and I'm so happy to see all of you.
I think that there is an approach to doing small transactions that can work at the local level. It has to be organized by organizations like Knox Heritage, who can be the conveners of a group to get this done. And what I was hoping to get out of this meeting is sort of forward movement on an approach, a fund approach at the local level that we can then show to other organizations in other parts of the country that have the same interest in getting small deals done.
That the historic tax credit program certainly works in the right context, the right ways for folks that do it, and it shouldn't work for only a handful of people like me that somehow crack this code. I hope that I could share enough about what I've done in the past, and in a very pragmatic, evidence-based way that other people can latch onto it and preserve a lot of historic properties out there.
Kim, thanks for this invitation to you and to your board. As Kim said, we've had a long association between the National Trust and Knox Heritage. When I first came to the Trust in 1994, I was asked to head up a program called Community Partners, and its purpose was to help preservation organizations move from advocacy into real estate development. And Knox Heritage is one of about a dozen organizations we work with, and I have to say they're our star pupil. And the renovation of this house being an example of the kind of skills that they learned. And we were, I fell in love with Knoxville. It's a great city, but it's also a small town. It seems to be a place where everybody knows everybody, and things seem to work well here. And when I look at Gay Street today, and I remember what it was like 15 years ago, there was nothing. It was vacant. There was nothing going on. And Kim took me on a little bit of a ride downtown, and it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. And I saw on your wall, which you didn't tell me about, that you got an award from the American Planning Association. And that is an unbelievable transformation. It always struck me that, you had 30,000 students out here at UT, and none of that economic power, none of that economic potential ever found its way downtown. And I assume some of those students are now living downtown and coming downtown and enjoying the theaters and the hot spots and just walking along that street, which is just a delight to be on. And Market Square. It was almost completely vacant 15 years ago.
You can get a cup of coffee at the same time.
Right. So it's just, I don't know of an American city that has done a better job in leveraging its historic resources to revitalize its downtown. And I work in cities all over the country. You've done a great job here. And so it's you to be congratulated. When it gets down to leadership, not only Knox Heritage, Kim, and the staff that she's had, but also you've got a nice core of local developers who understand the value of historic preservation and use those resources to make a profit and to bring vitality back to downtown Knoxville. And that's having that cadre of local developers that care about their town and want to do something for its future is critical. So we're here today to talk about breaking some new ground. Knox Heritage has been a leader in so many ways, and I don't think you realize how much the rest of the preservation world looks to Knoxville to see what's next. And so it shouldn't be too surprising that Knox Heritage is looking to create what would be the first locally managed historic tax credit fund. And since organizations like mine and dozens of other syndicators and direct investors can do the large projects, the part of the market that's least served is small transactions, which I'll define for right now as, say, projects that generate tax credits of $2 million or less. Right, so that would be a $10 million project, $2 million in credits. Get below that level, I don't know of a national investor that would do a project for less than $2 million in tax credit equity. So that's the niche. And you may say, well, how many transactions are in that niche? So last year, Park Service certified 750 projects. Half of those were under $1 million in credits. This is a small deal credit. we have no idea how those transactions are being monetized. We don't. In fact, we're doing a study now. I've got an intern from Rutgers who took a list. We gave her a list of all, a random sample of transactions under $1 million, addresses, email addresses, and she's calling around to ask the developers, how did you do this? How did you turn these credits into money? How did you pay the contractor? Did you use the credits yourself? Did you find an investor? We just don't know. So that's going to be part of what we can potentially contribute here is how is this being done elsewhere. So we're going to start out, since some of you are new to the historic tax credit entirely, we're going to do a little basics first. For some of you, it'll be a review. We're going to talk about what the specific problems are with small transactions, and Kim has really done a good job teeing that up. We're going to have a panel discussion with an accountant and a developer to talk about some of the issues they've had with small deal credits and transactions. But first thing I wanted to do was just, again, to reinforce what a great job you've done here. I passed around, we downloaded this from the National Park Service statistics yesterday. This is the number of transactions, historic tax credit transactions, done in Knoxville between 2001 and 2013. So you've got the addresses, the dollar amount of the project, the type of use. Turn over the back, it's a total of 30 projects over that 12-year period. Total of, if you look at the bottom for the economic impacts, almost $100 million in total development costs, generating 1,554 jobs. You see it broken out by construction and permanent jobs. Household income generated $52 million, and that's on credits of $16.4 million. That's a pretty good record. And if you look at the addresses, they're all concentrated on Gay Street, Market Square, and the general downtown area. So you've got a concentration of projects reinforcing each other and creating spin-off development next to those initial projects. So we're going to get started here on the basics. And for those of you who have not used the credit, this is an offset against federal income tax. 20% of the qualified rehab expenditures are eligible for the credit. So if you spend $100, you're getting a $20 credit. And just to make sure we're all on the same page again, I mean, this is not a deduction. This is a credit. It's a dollar-for-dollar reduction of the taxes that you owe. So the qualified rehab expenditures are construction and construction-related soft costs. So architectural fees, rehab loan interest, environmental reports. These are all the credit amounts that can, the expenditures that qualify for the historic tax credit. And the property has to be income producing. So there's no, you cannot do owner-occupied property. So it's going to be office, retail, mixed use, rental housing are typically the projects that are done. So the credits may be allocated to investor partners. So you can take the credit yourself as the managing member of an LLC, or you can bring in an investor partner who's in a better tax position to use the credits. And we'll look at the legal structure in a second. The investor has to be an owner of the property. So you can't, this is not a certificate, a tax certificate that you sell. This is, what you're doing is, as the general partner, you're selling ownership interest in an LLC. And the investor has to be an owner for the 5-year compliance period. So 5 years from placement in service to the 5th anniversary of placement in service. So the basic transaction is, and this is just an example. You generate $1 worth of credits on your transaction. You find an investor. They say, well, I'll pay you 95 cents on the dollar. So the investor is going to make a nickel on the discount. Because they're an owner of the property and they have an ownership interest in the property, they're going to get some of the cash flow. They're going to get some of the depreciation. And when they exit, and you're going to want them to exit after year 5, they have to sell their interest for a certain amount of money, and typically it's about 5% of their original capital. So you're not actually paying the credits back. You're paying back only a portion of the original equity that was contributed. So there is a recapture provision. what the government giveth, it can take away. Over the 5-year period, if the property goes into foreclosure, or if, based on bad advice, you alter the character-defining features of the building for that 5-year period, then there's a recapture. Now, there's no inspection, so, if you alter the building, chances are no one's going to see it, but, why would you do that? Except Kim. If it's here in Knoxville, Kim might see it. But if you spent $5 million renovating a building, you're not likely to want to spend more money changing it within the 5 years anyway, so there's no economic reason to do it. The more likely possibility is the project fails and you have a foreclosure. And a change of ownership is what triggers the recapture, but that risk burns off over 5 years. So if you're recapture in the first year, you owe the federal government back 80% of the credit. Happens in the second year, you owe back 60% of the credit. This last bullet is important. We did a study of all transactions over a 10-year period that included the recession. And we found that only 0.79% of projects experienced any kind of recapture. And I think it makes sense. It's only a 5-year compliance period. So if you've got a reasonably good piece of real estate and you've planned it well, even if you're under leased, you're kind of moving, you're just covering your debt, chances are it's going to last 5 years. And these projects also were underwritten twice, first by the banker, then by the equity investor, and so there's a lot of due diligence that's done. And so we've never had a recapture of the 109 projects we've done over the last 15 years. And as you can see, industry-wide, these projects perform much better than the average real estate project. I think over the same period, foreclosures on real estate in general were 3 or 4%. And you figure that's including 2008 through the balance of the recession. So moving on. So the project is jointly administered by the National Park Service and the Internal Revenue Service. So the Park Service has an application process. It's a 3-part process which Kim's organization will do for you. Part 1 gets the building on the National Register, where it has to be in order to qualify for the credits. It's either individually listed or it's a contributing building in a district. Part 2 is where you give your plans and specs to the National Park Service. Now this goes to the state initially, gets an approval, goes on to the National Park Service. That's where you make sure that the property meets what's called the Secretary of the Interior's standards. There's a set of rehab standards that require you to save character-defining features, not change the exterior look of the building and so forth. So you put those plans and specs in front of the Park Service, you get it approved, and then you do the work. And the Part 3 is where you do before and after shots. And again, this is something that a preservation consultant like Knox Heritage can do. And you show to the Park Service and to the state that you did what you said you were going to do. And they're pretty careful when they look at, we've never had a Part 3 denial, which means the credits won't vest. And technically, the credits don't vest until you have a Part 3, even though an investor may take it on their next quarterly tax return. But you need that Part 3 to keep the credits. And it's not something to mess around with because they're just tough. They want to make sure that you did it according to the standards. And Kim, I don't know if you've had any trouble getting Part 3s approved or not. Have you? Yeah, what we do as an investor is we have a consultant certify at every equity pay-in by the investor that the project's being done according to the standards, so we don't have any surprises at the end. So here's the basic legal structure, which I think is appropriate for a small deal. This is assuming the developer wants to bring in an investor partner, and that the developer, general partner, managing member is not in a tax position to use the credits themselves. So you're forming a partnership between the general partner and an investor limited partner. You're giving the investor a 99% ownership in the partnership so that they'll get 99% of the credits because credits follow ownership interests. And that partnership, the role of the investor is just to write a check. The role of the general partner, as you all know, is to do the project. Buy the property, put out the pre-development costs, hire the contractor, lease the project, property manage it over the 5-year compliance period. So that partnership rehabilitates the building and then leases it to various tenants. That's what the simplest way to do this. We call it a single-tier legal model. This is only one ownership entity. And I think to keep transaction costs down, it's probably the best way to do small transactions.
I think that's the simplest chart I've ever seen you show.
Well, right. No, I think and with the revenue procedure that we have in place with the IRS right now, this has become more and more utilized, I think, by the market. So, why do we need these credits? And I'm going to put this on a flip chart to illustrate rehab of any kind downtown, and historic rehab in particular, because it costs more, has financing gaps. I'm going to try to. Everybody see this? It's kind of in the way. And I go back to my days at Bank of America, and for historic properties, the appraisals always came in low and the cost came in high. You're talking about probably 20% more hard cost than new construction. And so I would always be up against a loan-to-value issue. And I would find myself loaning maybe 50% of the cost of the project. It was all I could do to stay within my lending parameters. And let's say the developer's putting up 10% in equity, and for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to say the federal historic tax credit nets 20%. We're still only at 80% of the cost of the project. And so we find developers that we work with looking for other sources to fill the gap. Tax increment financing proceeds, if that's available in your jurisdiction, subordinate debt from local government or the state government, private equity, bringing in another, bringing in another partner here to bring in equity to the project. State historic tax credits, which you don't have here in Tennessee, but there are 32 states that do, and so that could be another layer of financing.
We're working on it.
Yeah. And then, there is a sister program called New Markets Tax Credits, which we did provide through NTCIC to the Tennessee Theater. So they had 2 layers of credits. The New Markets credit is for transactions in low-income census tracts that are commercial that have some community benefit, and that fit the profile of the Tennessee Theater. This is in a low-income census tract. A theater is a commercial venture, but it was also historic, so we put New Markets and this federal together, and that's how we got to the 100% on the Tennessee Theater. And, the Tennessee Theater has no debt. It has grants, loans, and donations, and it has, some money from the developer, federal credits, New Markets tax credits. So that's how we put the capital stack together. But basically, the numbers don't work. You've got to, even with the federal credit, at least in this framework I put up here, you still have a 20% gap. So, I was at a meeting with the Federal Reserve the other day, and we're asking them to consider the federal historic tax credit as eligible for the Community Reinvestment Act, and some of the bankers sure know what that means. That means it gets a priority for funding to meet certain federal requirements. And the gentleman that was running the meeting said, well, this is market rate stuff. You're talking about market rate housing in downtown. Why does that need a credit? And furthermore, why would it need to get CRA eligibility? I ran through this kind of a capital stack analysis. Said the numbers don't work. Urban rehab is expensive. You can see the benefit. You can see downtown Knoxville. That's the benefit, is the spin-off, that the greater investment that occurs, but getting those first couple of projects done is the trick. And the credits are critical to that. Dave, any thoughts on this? Does this sound familiar?
Yeah, I guess just to tell you from a developer's kind of viewpoint on this, when I physically go out and look for a building or a project to take on or something to do, the very first thing I consider is whether or not this building is eligible for tax credits. Either either the 20% credit that John's talking about, there's also a 10% rehabilitation credit that actually may be more applicable to you all out here. It's a different type of building, we can talk about it more, but it's certainly something that's a lot easier to do, and I bet we'll talk about it a bit later, but that's probably one of the highest priorities as I look at it, besides just location, is whether the building's eligible or not, or whether it can be made eligible quickly. Two is talking about the approval process, and it's, goodness gracious, this process is like all others. If you've never done one, it seems impossible. Once you do it, it's easy, but you just have to kind of move it from the impossible category to the easy category. People like him here can handle a lot of that paperwork, and if you get the right architect, they can help you out tremendously with getting through that. Those two steps are relatively easy compared to the last one. And the trickiest one to me is always how to actually use the tax credit, because the federal government has a lot of rules on the specifics of who and how you actually use it. It is a complete no-no to talk about selling these credits. That is, I guess, technically illegal. So you're not, even though...
Selling ownership interests.
Yes, yes. So it's odd that all the document sets that you go through to kind of form your partnership, I mean, to me, just talking plain talk, it's sort of like a way to disguise the fact that you're selling these tax credits. Is really what it boils down to. And what you want to, anyway. So you can, in some cases, you can certainly use them yourselves personally, depending on how much the credits are and whether or not you particularly qualify personally. I have found up until recently, I was never able to use them myself. I always had to syndicate them with somebody else. And I know that when we get into the depths of that, and each story is going to be different. Because if you're doing a project that, I'll take maybe a typical project that I might do would be $7 or $8 million of kind of an overall project cost. It may generate, let's say, $1.5 million of historic tax credits. Well, good Lord, I need $1.5 million to make the project work, to go into the project. And so I got to find a partner willing to put up, essentially $1.5 million on the table. And that's not done without a fair amount of paperwork. And there are little deal funds set up, and there's a fair amount of brain damage to go through that syndicated process to make that work. However, of all the credits, and you were just talking about how $2 million and less is considered kind of a small deal. Every single project that I've done, I almost got to $2 million. I came within like $40,000 of hitting that thing. But every single project that I've done has been in that small deal thing. And here in Knoxville, Tennessee,
It's a big deal.
I'm going to say, maybe other than the standard knitting mills, maybe the Andrew Johnson building that comes up. I mean, that may be the only two projects that even might qualify for a big deal. Most of everything we're going to talk about is little stuff, and the hard stuff to talk about is the really little stuff. And maybe later on we can get into that, because I think that's going to be most helpful to people right here, is how to crack that code. I'll just say one last thing, is that years ago, back when I was kind of just getting started, I took on and did a lot of little buildings on Gay Street that were eligible for historic tax credits, and some of them were eligible for 20% credit, some of them were just eligible for 10% credit. And I just didn't either know about it at all or know enough about it, and I didn't use them at all. And I think back just how stupid that was. If I was just armed with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of time and energy, I would, I could have used a lot more credits back then. I would have been a lot more successful. I probably would have gotten a lot further along. But that's still true today. There's still a lot of buildings out there. I see people that just power right through doing a building. They can take credits easily, but they don't, because they just either don't want to screw that's not my word, they don't want to mess with it, or they just don't know enough. And I mean, that's why I'm glad to see so many people out here today, because this is great to find out and ask some questions, and it's out there.
And I think I'm one of those little people. I have a small building. I haven't applied for tax credits because I just don't know how to go about passing. I think two practical things would be very helpful for me perhaps other people here, is anyone have any accounting recommendations on accounts that have been doing this? Because there's a learning curve even for the accountants.
We've got some here in the audience. We're going to.
And David Ewan will be here in just a moment to speak to that, and Roger Goins has also been involved in our group.
And second thought, do you have any of the paperwork here that we can fill out that's in the National Park Service?
Yeah, Kim has the applications. We've also provided Knox Heritage with a set of standard documents for closing an historic tax credit transaction, which was a couple of years ago. It needed to be updated, but
Yeah, Dennis Ragsdale has turned those into sort of a boilerplate partnership agreement.
So, again, the whole idea here is to create a local capacity to do this, because we're going to go through the transaction costs if I were to do it, and you'll see how much it affects the net credit that goes to the deal.
Washington attorneys are expensive.
So just problems of the small deal. The market, again, we talked about national investors, U.S. Bank, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Nationwide Insurance, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan Chase. These are big regional national banks wanting to do large transactions. I mean, it takes just as long to do a small transaction, maybe longer, and the transaction costs are the same. So a $500,000 credit deal, $2.5 million transaction, $500,000 credit will take me as long to close, and my attorney fees are still going to be the same. Maybe they shouldn't be, but they are. And there's some specific problems, or the developer experience is the wild card. For a developer that's never done this, everything looks new and wrong, right? What's that fee for? And that seems like that's way too much. And does everybody else do it this way? And so you spend a lot of time educating them and arguing about things that, if there was an experienced investor, an experienced developer, like, oh yeah, that's normal. We understand that's what we paid last time. That's reasonable.
And while you're arguing, the clock is running.
The clock is running, exactly. And then you have the issue of small developer guarantor strength. Not really. There's underwriting issues with small deals that you wouldn't have with an experienced developer. So, they're cost the same, takes as much time, maybe longer, and my fee, which is a percentage of the equity, is very small. All right, so I'm getting paid less to do more. So it is, I think you get the picture. So again, we said earlier, average transaction, last year 750 transactions nationally, half of them under $1 million in credits. So again, small developers, individual owners doing these credit transactions, how they're monetized, how do you turn these credits into cash? We're not sure how it's being done. We used to have 6 or 7 small deal funds nationally. Chevron, which has always been a large investor in these credits, worked with syndicators like us, gave us a $10 million credit line, and we had to put up some money and take some risks, but we could do transactions as small as $500,000 in credits. And then when the recession hit, and then we had an important court case. How many of you have heard of Boardwalk Hall, the Boardwalk Hall case? Yeah. So anyway, it was a sea change in how tax credits are done. The state of New Jersey, through its sports authority, decided to renovate Convention Hall in Atlantic City, which was where the Miss America contest had been held for decades. And they brought in Pitney Bowes. They formed a for-profit subsidiary, brought in Pitney Bowes as the investor. The investor demanded all kinds of guarantees: guarantee of return, guarantee of construction completion, guarantee that credits were recaptured, and they essentially had a no-risk position. The IRS looked at it and said, you're not really a partner. A partner, a lender can say, pay me back if the loan goes bad, cover the cost overruns, cover the operating deficits, but you're an equity investor. You have to have a reasonable chance to have upside and downside in this transaction, and you're too protected. So, long story short, a lot of investors got out of the market, including Chevron, because there's all this uncertainty. The judge said, we know it when we see it. this is not really an equity investor, but we're not going to define what it takes to be deemed an investor and respected as an investor. So everybody jumped out of the market, including Chevron. All the small deal funds went away, and they've never come back. So there is no market nationally for small deals. So the situation is sort of like even worse than it was. The 500 block was, I don't know, $500,000 in credits, something like that. We were able to do that, but we just can't do it today.
It's now a land of opportunity.
I know. So just to, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but let's just, see what happens to a small deal in terms of transaction costs. Let's say the credits are $550,000, and our investor offered us 90 cents, and so the net at this point is $500,000 in credits or credit equity. Now we're going to pay the lawyers. So $40,000 is the least I can get done for. We got to have an accountant do projections, and that's about $15. Syndication fee, that's my fee for putting this all together, at 8% of the transaction. Audit and tax over 5 years, so $12,000 a year. I'm assuming you get audited financial statements and a tax return, because a national investor wants to see audited financials to make sure everything's being done properly. You've got to pay the investor some distributions so that they're deemed to be a real partner. So I'm assuming 2% here. That's another $50,000 over 5 years. And then the investor has to get paid something for interest when they leave. So I'm assuming 5% is enough to get the investor out at the end. So we're down to $255,000 net on what started out to be $550,000 credit. So really we've turned a 20% credit into a 10% credit. And it's all this leakage, not only in the beginning to get the deal closed, these costs right in here, but then all the way through the 5 years. So not a great, at this point you're probably saying, I'll find an equity partner to come up with $250,000 and avoid the brain damage, having to go to the National Park Service, through the state, all these applications, to net only half of what you started out looking for. So that's why small deal fund. We've got to figure out a way through this East Tennessee small deal fund to get these upfront transaction costs down. Cheaper lawyers, cheaper accounting. A local investor may not need an audited financial statement every year. They'll take a statement developed in-house. As long as they get a K1, they're happy. And the cash distributions could be handled differently. Audit and tax. Some of these costs I think can be much cheaper on a local basis, and that's the whole theory behind a small deal fund. So why don't we stop there for questions? We're going to bring a panel up in a second.
Early on, you talked about a restriction that it can't be owner-occupied, and I understand that. Can the investor have an ownership interest in the tenant at all, or does the IRS check that to the point where they can't be involved in it whatsoever?
Probably could lease that space back to yourself or to an affiliate. Okay. Yeah, you could do that.
I think that would be interesting for smaller investors who are looking for something for themselves, but again, if they could set up...
the general partner of the LLC is going to be an affiliate of the owner, right? And then, that LLC could lease a portion of the space back to the general partner or ownership entity. Yeah, that could work, sure.
And I've seen that done. I don't know how legal it is, but I've seen it. Lease it back to themselves. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty common in normal development deals, but I just wondered with that restriction if the IRS was going back and checking and making sure that the investor had no interest in as a tenant.
The only restriction that I'm aware of is if it's a non-profit sponsor and owner, there's a prohibition against sale leaseback in that situation. It's considered double dipping. Tax-exempt organizations getting that benefit, but as far as I know, it's a for-profit transaction. It's fine. Any other questions before we move on? All right. Well, we're going to get the two Davids up here.
I've worked with David to my right in the past on historic tax credits. that previous question about an investor-occupied building, generally that works. I'm actually doing that on a building that I'm developing right now, where I'm getting the 10% credit rather than 20% credit. So generally that will work. And I don't profess to be an expert on historic tax credits. I do several partnerships in the latter stages of the credits. I'm currently working on one right now with a exercise to put to get the investor out under the old way of doing the tax credits.
John, we keep skirting around. Can you explain the 10% credit since it's come up?
Yeah, so 10% credit, which is much less utilized than the 20% credit, is for old buildings built before 1936. Odd that that's the date that this was put in the code in 1986, and so they said, well, buildings 50 years or older, and at that point they didn't index the number. So it's buildings built before 1936 that are not historic, and they are not reused for housing. And so if you've got a building that's sitting outside an historic district, and it's not particularly noteworthy architecturally, no social history to it, you could use the 10% credit. Its main advantage, as David alluded to, is that you don't have to go through Park Service and do standards. It's just a transaction between you, your accountant, and the IRS, and you've got an IRS form to fill out at the end when the building is placed in service. But all the other rules are the same, except that the credit's cut in half. Now, that sounds good. The bad news is the transaction costs would be the same. And I think you probably, on a small deal, a $550 one becomes $225. By the time you pay everybody off, you probably have nothing left. So it has its disadvantages, but
you can use those credits yourself.
You can.
Obviously, the transaction costs come down. Correct?
Absolutely. In fact, yeah. The sweetest, the best way to get your transaction costs down is to use it yourself. Catch is, do you have enough tax liability to use the credits? You can carry them forward 15 years and take as much as you can. You're going to run into alternative minimum tax situation at a certain point, but we're going to talk a little bit about that. Let me just say, the credits, if you're in the alternative minimum tax situation, the credits are an offset against alternative minimum tax. And that's pretty unusual. You can invest in low-income housing tax credits, historic tax credits. I think tax-exempt bonds fall in that category, and a few other things. But historic tax credits are one of the few ways you can actually lower your alternative minimum tax. Everybody generally familiar with? Can we talk a little bit about what that is and why you get in that situation?
The AMT was brought in I think 1969, and it was a attempt by the IRS to prevent some of the tax schemes, I guess, that were brought in for particularly real estate. It went against a lot of wealthy investors is really what it was intended to do. Since then it's been changed. It's now indexed for inflation, but it captures more and more people. I mean, I'm seeing it in my practice, people every year that have never been hit by AMT. It's a disincentive for a lot of people. Anything that can offset that AMT is extremely beneficial. And to go into how it gets calculated, I don't think we have the time, but it's...
Right. In fact, that handout that you collected when you came in has an article that was written by a couple of accountants at Novogradac & Company, which specializes in historic tax credit accounting. I edited it to make it more understandable by the average person, but it's got a calculation. It takes someone, it looks at someone what their ability to take the tax credits is with AMT, and then looking at it with an AMT offset. There's a dramatic difference in the amount of credits you can take on an annual basis. So, David, you've talked about different projects you've done. You've done some 10% credit, 20%. Can you give us sort of a range of the ways that you've monetized credits from, I know maybe keeping them yourself have been from that, and what some of the alternatives you've used?
Well, let me first say, I guess if you followed John's chart here, I'm surprised you guys are still here in the room, because that's pretty scary. But this obviously very works. I've never done this until Tim handed out this chart, but I have actually completed 17 historic tax credit projects, and I'm currently working on 7 more. And so it can be a powerful tool if you can, figure it out and digest it, and and B, get it done, because it doesn't have to be this scary. We've been talking a little bit about the 10% credit. A lot of you, we're starting to do a lot of projects up on the Broadway Central Corridor. A lot of that is not in the historic district. It's just a bunch of old buildings up there that suddenly are becoming, very sought after and useful again. And part of the reason I love that corridor from a developer investment standpoint is that many of those buildings are eligible for the 10% credit, which is, to me, those are absolute snaps. Those are very, very, very easy to do compared to the 20% credit. And if you're in a position to actually use the credit yourself, I almost view it as the cost is somewhere close to $0 additional dollars for me to actually get that 10% credit.
And have you been able to? Have you carried some of those forward, so you didn't use it all in the tax year that was placed in service?
Yeah, the kick is if you use it yourself, you actually have to pay taxes.
That's right. You got to be making money right there.
Yeah, you got to be making money to use the credit. So that's why up until really recently, I've never fallen in that category. But now that I'm actually a taxpayer, I find these credits pretty darn useful. So the 10% credit, like I said, if can be an extremely useful tool because of its simplicity, and I think there are some specific questions. The eligibility issue is pretty darn easy. Is it a commercial building? Was it built before 1936? If the answer is yes to that, and you don't really screw it up too badly, it's just darn eligible, and it's literally when you get done with the project, you kind of need to know what you spent on the building, and there's a line you fill out on form 3436, and it's almost that simple. Almost that simple.
You have to apply to the National Park Service.
Do you need any kind of certification and it's not an historic building, or is that just, do you do that here?
I don't know that we do that here.
Yeah, technically.
Is there any delineation between commercial income versus residential income as to how it applies?
No, if it's rental, that's fine. Rental.
It has to just be an income producer.
Income producer, exactly. Right. So, I'm sorry. On the 10% credit, yeah, you're not going to be able to create basis out of any portion of the building that's residential in nature. So if you're doing first floor commercial and you've got 20 apartments above, this isn't going to work for you. I guess you could take it, but the benefit's going to only relate to the commercial part of the building.
Can you take partial credit?
Well, no, in other words, all right, so the building to be determined commercial, it's got to be 80-20. Let's say take the partial credit. You can take the credit, let's say the cost is $100 and you spend 20 on the commercial, it's going to be 10% times the $20. You're not going to take the credit on the costs of the residential. All right.
Yeah, the differentiation of what is commercial, in this case, oddly, like a hotel, commercial. An apartment in this particular application is considered residential. Your private home would be residential, so those would not qualify for the 10%. But any commercial activity, I think, besides apartments or your personal residence, qualifies.
Senior living, institutional living.
I think so, but he's probably better answering it. Yeah.
So let's talk about the market for small deals. In 1986, if anybody remember how these transactions were done pre-86, you'd get 25 lawyers, 15 accountants, 18 dentists, and a couple of bankers, and put them in a master limited partnership, and these investors never saw the building, they have no idea what's going on, they're completely detached, not participating in the transaction at all, and that was legal pre-86. In 86, Congress decided that was an abuse, and they limited individuals to $25,000 annually in passive losses, or losses that you, these credits are considered a passive credit, so losses that you incur, $25,000 in losses times 20, I mean, you wind up at $757,500 in credits on an annual basis, except for, and they made an exception for real estate professionals, and that's all explained in detail in your handout. Real estate professionals have a special exemption that makes them like corporations. Corporations can take an unlimited amount of these credits. That's why earlier when I talked about who buys them nationally, it's all big companies. Closely held corporations, there's some limitations, but they can take the credits. But individuals, if you're going to try to syndicate your credits, either you're a real estate professional and you take the credits yourself in an unlimited way, or you find a partner who's a real estate professional. I wanted to ask David if you could talk a little bit about how you define real estate professional in the code and what kinds of people qualify.
Typically, a real estate professional is somebody who spends more than 500 hours in real estate each year. Now, what exactly those 500 hours can be comprised of is fairly nebulous. Realtors are real estate professionals. Developers like David are real estate professionals. I'm actually technically a real estate professional because I own buildings. I spend a lot of time on those buildings. I own apartment buildings as well. But I'm somewhat like David. I don't pay a lot of tax either because of I have low-income apartment projects with the low-income tax credits. The real advantages of being a real estate professional is you can use those losses way beyond the $25,000 limit. So if you do it right and you structure your deals correctly, you really don't have a whole lot of tax because you're also not subject to self-employment tax on a lot of that income.
Right. So part of the effort of the small deal fund here has to be to identify real estate professionals who would be interested in being limited partners in a fund. Or, and I would highly recommend that you start off doing a deal at a time. I mean, there's no point in incurring the overhead of a fund until you've got a head of steam. So you help facilitate 2 or 3 transactions, and in so doing, identify a real estate professional as one option. Another would be a small local bank that has a certain amount of tax liability that they can offset with the credits. But the untapped market is individuals, but that's limited to those people who qualify as real estate professionals. So construction contractors would be another category. Realtors, property managers. One of the architects, I guess, if they're involved in real estate, potentially.
If they're involved in real estate, they can be.
Obviously, this is a discussion with your accountant that there's 5 or 6 boxes to check to make sure you qualify. But so if you are a real estate professional and you look at your tax position and your projected taxes, say, I could use a certain amount of these credits, but at a point, even if I offset alternative minimum tax, I can only use, say, $500,000 a year, and I've got $1 million in credits. So you bring in another real estate professional as a partner, and you negotiate a price for their participation, dollars worth of credits. Maybe they're paying you 95 cents. Whatever you negotiate is up. It's up to your. And you may market the credits to a couple of different parties and see what kind of pricing you can get. So either finding small local companies that can use the credits on an unlimited basis, or we're going to be open to a small local transaction done with a local accountant or lawyer would be one source, and then this untapped group of real estate professionals. Now, I'm assuming that accountants who do the business of this town know who those people are, right? And so we need advisors to the fund to say, I've got 4 or 5 clients that are in the tax position, and by the way, they're also an AMT. This would be a unique way to seriously reduce their taxes. But those would be the people most motivated, right? I mean, they've got a tax they have to pay, and now all of a sudden there's this sort of way to get it lower.
Well, that's actually what I've done recently. I've set up a deal where I'm one of 3. The other 2 are active real estate investors, and they're clients of mine.
So how do the partnership interests break down in that partnership?
Just a three-way split, very simple.
Okay, 33% each, and you're each taking a third of the credits?
Right.
Okay. So that's this 99-1 notion that I put on, that's a typical transaction structure, but if you could use 10, even 15, 20% of the credits, now it's 20-80. So you can split up the ownership interest according to who's taking what portion of the credits. And so that, you can dig into that article. I read it again. The article is about 5 or 6 years old. I read it again last night, and I couldn't believe how dense it was. But, the idea is to take it and hand it to your accountant and say, look at this, read this, and then, we can set up a consultation between your accountant and David and some others, and we need a local set of accountants to say, okay, I get this. Now let's go out and find the people that can benefit from it. And there's got to be scores of people that would and look at the recapture rate. I mean, is there real risk here? I mean, if you again the fund manager or Knox Heritage is going to have to put somebody on staff or have a consulting arrangement with someone who's going to underwrite the deals and make sure that they make economic sense. Forget about all the credits and the subsidy. The real estate has to make sense. This is not a tax shelter. This is a real arm's-length investment, and investors are going to worry about recapture. I mean, what's the possibility the bank's going to foreclose on this transaction before the 5 years is up? They're not going to pay the federal government back. That portion of the credits is still vested. So let's talk about actually the slide we're not going to put up, the small deal fund team. What are we looking for? This is a work in progress, right? So the way I see this is you need an organization that's going to pull all this together, and that's obviously Knox Heritage. Their role would be to identify projects. So we need people in this room and others to say, hey, I've got a deal. I'm looking to go into construction, this summer, this fall. Let's plan this out. Let's look at, is it a 10% credit transaction? Is it 20%? In order to attract investors, there has to be some underwriting of the project. And then, there's the National Park Service applications to be going for the 20% credit have to be done. So that's sort of the work, the organizing work, facilitating work ought to be in this building. We need, as part of that team, 1 or 2 or 3 accountants who know how to do the projections. The investors want to know, what's my return on investment? And what's this look like? How much cash flow am I going to reasonably expect to get? How solid is this real estate? Where's the loan coming from, and how much of that is that of the capital stack? So there has to be a write-up for you to then market this to your real estate professionals or small local companies. We need 1, 2, or 3 lawyers who know how to close these transactions. We've provided standard documents. We'll update those. Again, everything's got to be done. If it's cookie cutter, and the documents are relatively the same, and as you do 1 or 2 or 3 of these, you're going to begin using the same documents, and your costs will be even less. And we need a set of investors. We can start off doing project at a time where we identify a real estate professional or a small local company, do a project, close it, write it up as a case study, move on to the next one. At some point, once you get a volume and you go all of East Tennessee to as your market, it might make sense to have investors invest in an upper tier fund, say 10, 15 million. Maybe you're doing projects of 2 million and less, so you get 7 or 8 transactions in one fund, and that fund becomes the investor in individual projects around East Tennessee. I would see that as step 2.
Because that's how y'all work. You had an investor.
We actually do both. We've done 7 or 8 funds nationally, where the investor says, all right, $50 million is as much as I want to do. As you close transactions into this fund, tell us how much you need. So it's going to be, okay, we just closed a deal for $5 million. At construction closing, we're going to do a capital call for $1 million and on down the line until we get all the equity in. And so the fund becomes the home of 5 or 6 transactions. But that takes staff maintenance, it takes overhead, it takes, you've got your own accounting to do, your own asset management, and I think you need volume to make that make sense. And I think
So we'll start as in that.
You're right, that's right, yeah. So, Kim, where do you, why don't you talk a little bit about what you've been doing and where you are at this point in terms of who do you have as advisors and what your needs are?
Well, it started, gosh, about 2 years ago, and Daniel was a part of the guinea pig process where we got together with Tom McAdams and David Dewhurst and John Craig and Roger Goins and some other folks and said, is there a way to do, oh, and Dennis Ragsdale, the attorney, is there a way to do this? And it was at your suggestion. I think we had a meeting one time when I was in D.C. and you brought it up, and I thought that's a brilliant idea. And we started down that path, and we had our first deal, Taylor Lofts, and we actually had a billionaire investor who wanted to do it and who owns bank. But unfortunately, the tax liability, passive losses, the type of corporation for the bank, that one didn't work. But it was very fascinating to see. We just one meeting with him, and he said, I'm in, let's do it. And so that gave us confidence to say, okay, if it makes sense to a billionaire, this probably is something we should look at. And then we got sidetracked by this little project you're sitting in, and now we're back. And Dennis Ragsdale did take the documents that you shared with us and got them into a boilerplate forms, because that's what we're trying to do, is lower those transaction costs. We want the lawyers to make money, but we don't want those transaction costs, hush now, to inhibit projects getting done, because that's our mission goal here. We want to help projects get done. And so we've evolved in that. We do our own projects where we purchase and rehab real estate. Now you see we might be buying a school. So we're doing a lot more real estate work. And we've also been doing the tax credit consulting for the last few years. So we've been building our expertise. And then we have Todd Morgan, who's our Director of Preservation Field Services, who's helping us expand our real estate work. And to me, this is a logical next step, because we do a lot of work in small towns around the region. We've taken you out on developer road shows, and you've been out there with us too, with these buildings, and that's the money is the issue. And so that's why we're very motivated to figure out how to get these small projects done.
Well, let's turn around and do some Q&A. I know some of you have projects you're thinking about. Let's hear about what may be in the pipeline and what might qualify for this kind of tax credit financing. Yeah.
One technical question. You have to put a fairly significant amount of money into the project compared to the purchase price. Is that 8%, 100%?
Oh, the basis.
Well, right. Okay. So the rule is that if you pay $1,000 for the building, you have to do at least that much in rehab in order to meet the so-called substantial rehab test. So, not every building is going to work, right? If you got a building that's already occupied and it's got a good NOI and it's worth something, you got to how much rehab does this really need? This is not a moderate rehab program. It has to be a building. Most of the buildings we do are the developer buys it vacant and it's deteriorating for years. Maybe in a nonprofit context, they got it for $1 from the city because it's a blighting influence on a commercial corridor. So you got to run those numbers first and make sure there's enough to do, and that's rehab. But then the soft costs related to the rehab, and that's going to be worth at least as much as your adjusted basis, which is essentially what you paid for the building. Yeah, right. Now, if you've held the building. You had an adjusted basis. Dave, why don't you talk about how you calculate adjusted basis?
Tomorrow we're purchasing the First Christian Church. Just an example. We're buying this property for nearly $600,000. I can guarantee you that I will spend at least $600,000 on the property. I will. You just will. There are. It's really a pretty easy test. You got whatever you spend on the building, pretty much. You spend more than that on improvements to it, then you pass the test. I didn't say that exactly the way this guy would say it, but that's and this is not difficult to do.
Right, and you've got to spend that equivalent of the adjusted basis within a 24-month period that ends when the building is placed in service. And if you've held a building for a while and you've depreciated it, say, for 5 years, that produces your adjusted basis, right? So that this is something you do with your accountant. Just make sure you do that math. As David said, it's rare that you don't meet the test, but you don't want to get into it and then say, oops, I can't get these credits.
John, could you
yeah.
just in passing talk about how you can combine credits? Just say no that that's possible, because I know some might be low-income housing.
Yeah, I mean, you can
or,
quote twin historic and low-income housing tax credits. So for a building that's going to be a renovated building that's historic and it's going to be occupied by people who are at or below 60% of median income, and David's done a few of these. I don't know if the other David has or not. That's allocated by the state housing finance agency, and so you can combine the two.
Knox County generally doesn't qualify for the low-income tax credits. You have to step out to Rock County.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Okay. Knox County income is too low.
All right.
At this point, now they adjust that, but Rock County, Tennessee, THCA, Knoxville, Knox County does not qualify.
there's a finite amount of those.
Yes, that's the view.
Oh, so the state has that rule where to really allocate.
But existing ones would qualify for the 538
Okay. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a new markets tax credit program that's allocated through organizations like mine that have a certification from the U.S. Treasury. So if you had a historic building in a low-income census tract that was commercial and had some public benefit associated with it, let's say you're doing a charter school or you're doing a health clinic or something like that, that would have a high interest level from so-called CDEs. I don't necessarily recommend that you go to that kind of complication on a small deal. In fact, maybe it's not relevant for this group. We're talking about, the smallest allocation I could make would be a project of $5 million where the credit allocation is $5 million. So that, it's sort of on the upper end of small.
So it's used on the Tennessee Theater.
Yeah, I mean, the boxes and arrows that you saw earlier would be like 12 more boxes and arrows. I mean, the brain damage is substantial. So I'd be happy to talk to you about whether it makes sense for you to try to get those new markets tax credits. There are CDEs in Tennessee that have allocations, but it is daunting. But it's just another layer of financing. If you got a capital stack, you're just not quite getting there, it might be worth considering, but it's not for the faint of heart. Others that have projects or just general questions about how you might.
Kim, as you have done your road show and gone into some of the surrounding communities here, 2 or 3 questions. Of course, the organization here, Knox Heritage, does a terrific job, but as you go into certain other areas, for example, my hometown of Rogersville, there is a difference between the National Historic District, even though it's the second oldest town, and the actual local registered district. And we went through the process and spoke with Lewis Jackson, and a little project that we had, small though it was, right off Main Street, did not qualify for either 10% or the 20% credit by virtue of it not falling into a contributing structure to the historic district. And that was a little disconcerting and somewhat disappointing as it didn't apply for one reason, because it was storefront and then residential on top, which disqualified it for a portion of it. But are you seeing that, and do you see some of your areas outside of Knoxville, as an example, running into that problem?
Yeah, we do. This is an ongoing discussion that we're having with the State Historic Preservation Office. We have a philosophical difference about what is eligible for the National Register and what isn't. And so that's a political and bureaucratic process that we are working on. Downtown Maryville is in the same bucket because we've worked together, the National Register District and Maryville, to bring in those incentives and the staffing at the state in that situation. We think that they're doing too strict a reading instead of preservation and historic buildings. So instead of preservation being a tool, which we think it is, they seem to think it's a gift. So that's something as an advocacy organization that we can work on at the state level to try to get the SHPO's office to really understand that they're part of the development team in a way, and they need to help us with buildings that, if you just look at it, it's obvious it's National Register eligible, but there's some archaic rules going on. But we're happy to help you with that because it's one of my favorite fights to pick.
I think Knoxville was extraordinarily lucky that 20, 30 years ago, we worked on placing these large historic districts on the National Register back when nobody, I mean, this might have even been pre-Christopher Kendrick times.
It was.
Well, and a lot of that work was done by Ann Bennett, and I'm not even sure there couldn't have been a constituency for it back then, but a lot of that work got done here in Knoxville back when it wasn't cool. And if it hadn't been done back then, well, Knoxville would, we literally would be talking about downtown west as the center of our community. And I'll go out and go to, like Johnson City to me strikes me. You know, I'll go up there and they're making progress, but they still have big swatches of their downtown that are certainly historic, but they still have this reticence to like go through the process and get these districts set up, and there's this suspicion that I won't be able to tear my building down. This is going to be problematic, and
Which is
and I go to, and I'll go to these times. I go, well, how about coming and helping us restore these buildings? I go, you've got step one. You need to get as much of this downtown or as much of these historic buildings on the register as you can, because you just took away the most major tool that we use to go do things like this. And so without that, I had a great trip here. Thanks for lunch. But, and I mean, there are a number of smaller towns here in East Tennessee that have done that and done a good job at it, but there's a whole lot of them that just kind of have a blank stare on their face, like, well, what do you mean National Historic District? And you're like, oh, Lord. You don't get that going, and that takes a little while to do it. That's what a lot of these municipalities really need to be working on right now, to get that down and get it done so people like me or younger people like me that will see that opportunity will have the tools to rival those smaller communities at the right time.
just a little background for those who aren't used to walking around in the preservation world. There is a difference. There's the National Register of Historic Places, which requires an application process. We do those all the time. We're starting on getting to school right now. And you go through the state Office of Preservation, and it goes on to national. That makes you eligible for the historic rehabilitation tax credits. It makes you eligible for some grant funding in certain cases, but that's not a big incentive. And it has an environmental review factor, Section 106 review, if your property is impacted by federally funded projects. The thing is that it's counterintuitive. You can bulldoze a National Register listed property. This house was listed on the National Register. One of the reasons the Asset Foundation bought it was because somebody could just bulldoze it and there'd be nothing you could do. The real review process happens with the local historic districts, which we have them all over town in Knoxville. And that's when a local review board looks at exterior changes that are visible from the street and work with you on that. So they're totally different things.
Yeah, National Register is sort of a no-brainer. I mean, getting on the National Register for downtown just accesses the credits. It does. There's no design. If you can renovate your building and you don't use the credits, there's no design control unless it becomes a local historic district. So, as David said, it makes no sense at all not to avail yourself of the planning tool and the financing, because there's no downside. Owners can still make their own decisions about what they want to do with their properties. The only restrictions come in if they want to use the credits. So it's, a building in a downtown can be contributing, but not particularly architecturally great. If it's in a district, the bar is much lower. If it has to be individually listed, it's got to be a building, kind of like this one, which most commercial buildings are, they're pretty mundane and vernacular.
I got some really ugly.
Kim's good on getting them on the register. Yeah. Park Service is very, very strict about their rehab standards, but what they're not terribly strict at is what they'll put on the National Register, which is a good thing, because they see it, okay, we want to make sure these projects get access to the credits. And so the bar for getting your building on, you get someone like Kim at Knox Heritage to do some kind of go to the library, look up the building, just about any pretext will do. I mean, we had a project in Beacon, New York. It was an old Nabisco packaging plant. It was just a slab. I mean, it was just a rectangle. I mean, it was just about as industrial and as ugly as can be. And we hired a consultant and went to the local library, and their rationale for it being eligible for the National Register of Historic Places individually was it contributed greatly to the development of Beacon in the 1930s. Well, what building wouldn't qualify under those circumstances? So we laugh about it a little bit, so there's a lot of junk on the National Register, but it's a good thing because it broadens the net of the buildings that will qualify for the credits. Yes?
Outside of this is a little detailed, but so hang in there with me, but outside of a small deal fund or larger fund, if you have two partners that go in on a project together, one has an income and they can utilize the credits better than another partner. Is there any way you can trade, barter, or otherwise sell between partners that are investing into a project?
Yeah, David, do you want to take that?
There's actually a new the IRS issued basically a policy statement on that last year. I've got a copy of it in my bag. 2014-12, and it sets out the ownership percentages and how you can comply with the rules. You can't sell those credits after the project. If you stick to those rules, and they're fairly straightforward, you can make it comply. You've got to have a minimum of 1% on the managing partner side and a minimum, they've got minimum capital requirements. But it's kind of reasonable what they're asking for. So that was in response to the
So that's that all investors want to know today that their transaction meets the requirements of 2014-12. It's the historic tax credit revenue procedure. It came out January 2013. It's a safe harbor. You do the following 5 things, and we will not audit you. That's the IRS base, but it says it right in there. So we will not, or if we audit you, we're not going to disallow the credits as long as you check those 5 boxes. So it is today a safer credit to invest in because it's very prescribed, as David said, and they're not hard rules to meet. I mean, they make common sense, and the Historic Tax Credit Coalition that I chair worked with the IRS all through 2013 to get this revenue procedure in place because the Boardwalk decision had left all these questions about, well, all right, so we know those guys didn't qualify for the credits. What do we need to do to be respected as a partner? And that's what this lays out. So if you want to you've got an attorney closing the project, you want to make sure they've looked at the procedure and that everything in your partnership meets the requirements of the safe harbor. And then you're really going to be, that's about as safe as, it makes it audit-proof, literally. It's audit-proof.
John, could you talk about the pricing for credits? Because I know it's whatever the market will bear, but what kind of numbers?
So in a small deal, it's between the managing member and the investor, and it's a negotiation. You got $1 worth of credits. The investor's going to get, if they're paying 95 cents on the dollar, they're going to get a nickel. As I said earlier, they're going to get a portion of the cash flow so they can be viewed as a real arm's length real estate investor, not just looking for a tax shelter. They're going to get a share of the depreciation. And when they sell their interest in year 5, which is at their discretion, this put arrangement is that the investor has to make the decision to get out. You're going to pay them, say, 5% of the original capital, something like that. It can't be less than that. So the question is, well, what's that bundle of tax benefits worth to the investor? They're not just getting the credits, they're getting some economics. And so traditionally, small deal funds were paying sort of, 80 to 85 cents on the dollar. David, I don't know what your experience has been on small deals. I would not restrict this. I'd go for a higher pricing. If you're going to make it easy for the investor and all I have to do is essentially sign up and be a money partner, I think locally that pricing could be higher. But I wouldn't set it because the national syndicators are looking to they're going to take their portion of the profits. So David, what are your thoughts on that? You think we can get higher pricing if we do this locally? And that would be my hope.
Gosh, I've always approached this from the, obviously, the developer side. So I can certainly tell you that I did 8 or 9 deals with Chevron in the past, and the deal was always virtually identical. And they put between 90 and 95. They paid you 90 and 95 cents on the credit, and every year they took 3% for 5 years. They paid you 15 at the end.
3% of the cash.
3% of what they invested. When it all washed out, it was a pretty good deal. Probably close to 75%, something like that.
That you netted.
But I netted better than that. But
right.
That's why he has tax liability now.
If you've got a $1 million project, that's $1 million tax credits. That's $750,000 really net back to the developer in that particular circumstance. So times changed a little bit now. It's a little more nuanced. This participant, I guarantee you, Chevron didn't participate in any of the downside of my projects.
Right. Yeah, no, those were the good old days.
Yeah, today, I guess there needs to be I think a little more honest participation in that. And so when it comes down to the creation of the local deal fund, it's a little hard to set that number. I think this works as long as it's very standardized. You get it into, literally here's the document set we use for each one. It's everybody can understand it. And this is how it works. And it's a little hard to say that put a particular number on the credit value. It's pretty safe for the investor because they typically aren't. I imagine in the deal you can do it in a lot of different ways, but they need to bring the credits on board before you get too pregnant with it. Anyway, that's a little hard to say given. I'm really great about talking about the way it was. And I'm really great at talking about the way it is. You keep it yourself. That's really, really the way to go. You can manage to pull that off.
So, participating in the downside, really for the investor, is just, okay, I was figuring on getting, say, 2% of my investment on an annual basis as a return from cash flow, cash distributions. The downside is just you don't get that, right? Investor's not going to, now, the downside could be there's a recapture. That would be the worst case. And under the new revenue procedure, you can't guarantee that recapture. That's one of the things that you get out of it. But in exchange, the investor has to get a little more cash flow to be seen as a partner. So it cuts both ways. Your guarantees are down, but their risks, the risk of disallowance, the Park Service would have covered. The IRS came in and said, well, you think you were in the safe harbor, but you really weren't. That's the investor's risk now, not your risk. So it cuts both ways. Other questions?
Has the national government, has the IRS done anything other than the boardwalk deal? Have they gone after challenging any other partnerships' legitimacy or shown evidence that they've interested in doing that?
That's the reason we did the revenue procedure is because after boardwalk call, they went, aha, let's go after some of these other taxpayers that have similar structured transactions, and the audits increased dramatically after boardwalk call. And to me, I'm not a lawyer, but it seems the question of taxpayer fairness involved here. The judge broke some new ground. There was a lot of transactions had some similar. Most transactions had features similar to boardwalk call. Every transaction done before boardwalk call, the developer guaranteed recapture. All right, so the IRS, it's open field day, right? Oh, look at all these transactions that look like boardwalk call. And so when we saw the audit activity go up, we called the partner with the IRS and said, we got to sit down and do a procedure because the case really promoted more questions and gave very few answers. So now, through the Historic Tax Credit Coalition, we monitor audits. Our lawyer members say, okay, I'm participating in an audit, and we're tracking it. So far, the audits, we haven't seen them go down. We're hoping they do. But some investors have left the market because they were audited so heavily they couldn't, their senior management said enough is enough. That's all in the past. Going forward, you meet the procedure, you stay in the safe harbor. It's a very, right. Some investors that have been very good at preservation got hurt the most, and that's a shame. Because they're saying, oh, you should have known that that was partnership law back then. Well, the IRS issues guidance every, couple of times a year on partnership structures and what, it changes. So to say you should have known 3-4 years ago, 4 years before Boardwell College, you could have structured it that way, to me is unfair. But the IRS does that. Okay. We've got time for a few more questions, and then we'll adjourn. Anyone else want to talk about a project they have or questions about how the credits work? All right, so we need lawyers who want to be advisors to this fund. We need accountants who want to be advisors to this fund or who want to help us find investors. And we need real estate professionals who are interested in being partners on transactions so we can marry projects and investors and try to get this done in a way that makes sense economically for the small deal. And hopefully in the next year, we can come back and look at the first few transactions that have been done. And this is all being videotaped because we're trying to do this in a couple of different places, but we're banking, we're hoping, we're counting on Knox Heritage to set this up and to be a model for other cities. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, John. David.